Stuart, would you turn right around and ask Pat to get everybody in here? And we'll try to get started. We're running a little bit late. If you will, as quickly as you can, move in your seat, and we're a little over time already. And I want you to hear Anne Klein and give her plenty of time. Okay, into your seats, if you will. Try to round up your conversations. What? You're going to do it? Okay. Don't. Yeah. Well, you can. Just she's concerned about her time. Just remember that. If you will, take your seats, please. And I just wanted to mention Stuart Nelson, who's been working. You've seen him around the camera and helping all here. He's at the Institute for Spirituality and Health as our project manager. If you would, I'd appreciate a little clap for Stuart and his work. He's going to introduce Anne Klein because he was a student of Anne.
So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Anne Klein here. She's the founder and teacher at Dawn Mountain Tibetan Buddhist Temple here in Houston, as well as a member of the faculty at Rice University. She is a 40-year practicing Buddhist. She's been practicing since 1971. So she studied with many, many prominent teachers, both in the United States, but mainly in Asia, mostly in the Tibetan Buddhist lineage there. Some of whom were hand-picked by the Dalai Lama. She graduated with a degree in English. She was cum laude highest honors from Harper College. She received her master's degree from University of Wisconsin in Buddhist Studies. She received her PhD from University of Virginia in Religious Studies and Tibetan Studies. And she is currently interested in exploring embodiment in meditative practice to cultivate an awareness of cultural and personal insights. I just want to say I was a student of Anne's at Rice University, and some professors teach you things about the world, and some professors teach you how to think about things in the world. But Anne was really unique because she taught me how to be in the world, and it was a really lovely contribution to my education. So with that, we can welcome Anne Klein.
Okay now? Yes. Thank you, Stuart. That was lovely. And thank you, ISH, for having this amazing gathering and for inviting me to it. Thank you all for being here and sitting upright and ready to engage with attention. Attention is really what I'm talking about today. I want to talk about the connection that attention creates between ourselves and ourselves, the connection that attention fosters between ourselves and others, ourselves and the world, ourselves and our own body, the energies of our body. And I'm going to do that in 4 short parts. First, I'm going to describe what I mean by attention, referring to some traditional sources in the Buddhist tradition. And then I'm going to talk a little bit, and we fortunately heard a good bit already, about the cultivation of attention. And I'm going to add a piece to this, which is to discuss how the cultivation of attention is related with the flowing currents in our own bodies, which are a very important category in Asian cultures and Asian meditative and also medical traditions. So that's the second thing. Looking at how attention shifts actually what David Wallen calls our stance in life. Third, I'm going to talk about the effects of the cultivation of attention, both in terms of traditional terms, traditional spiritual understanding, and also a little taste of what some of contemplative neuroscience is saying today about the benefits of cultivating attention. And finally, and in some ways most importantly, something that we've also heard a little bit about already, thanks to John, the way in which attention is itself an expression of love. So most simply then, to begin, what is attention? Generally speaking, by attention we mean a capacity to link one's mind, one's seeing, one's awareness with a consciously chosen object. So our mind likes to skitter around. That's not always an indication of our attention. Tethering the mind to a chosen object. Attention is in this way the fundamental function of what is traditionally known as mindfulness in the Buddhist traditions. And really today I am using the words attention and mindfulness fairly interchangeably. But one very important point I want to make is that attention or mindfulness is not a function of the mind alone. It's a function of our entire being, our entire body. Hence, I'm veering away a little bit from the word mindfulness, lest it sound like some kind of head process. Mindfulness itself, it might be interesting to know, is a translation of the Sanskrit word smrti. And smrti is actually cognate with our word for memory, smrti, memory. And so attention fundamentally has to do both with memory, and in fact, as we cultivate stable attention, memories tend to come, awareness tends to grow. It also, however, and the main way that we're talking about it today, is attention is a capacity to be in the sacred present moment, about which John has also talked very beautifully this morning. It is the function of being present that is central to what I'm talking about. So what happens when we pay attention? Well, attention brings us into life. What is actually is only the present moment. To be attentive is to be present to our loved ones, is to be present to ourselves, is to be present to our grief, which is one reason people sometimes run away from attention, because it does bring awareness of our pain, and it also brings a very, very clear awareness of our suffering. When we attend, we can't help but notice that the fabric of life is both brighter than we might have noticed before, there is more texture to it, and we also can't help but notice sometimes that the fabric of our lives is also fraying a bit at the ends. So attention brings us a lot of information, and some of it is not always welcome information, and so sometimes we push back against the cultivation of attention. I teach a contemplative practicum at Rice, in addition to, of course, teaching a meditation at Dawn Mountain. That's how I met Stuart, actually, in that contemplative practicum. And, people say all kinds of things. I don't like to, I don't want to sit down, my work is so important, it's calling me. And anyone who has been in the process of beginning or sustaining a daily, regular meditation practice, i.e. not when you feel like it, just doing it on a daily basis, we all know this, I'll call it resistance, right? And that's a very important feature. Lacking attention, we also have a different relationship to happiness and suffering than we have when we have attention. Without attention, happiness or suffering takes us over. We identify with it. We are our grief. We are our happiness, which makes it all the more devastating when we lose that happiness. We're not just losing happiness, we're losing an identity. So identifying with our emotions, good or bad, is a very particular stance in the world that actually makes us more vulnerable and more impervious to change. So one of the things that attention does, and this is really important psychologically and spiritually, one of the things that the cultivation of attention will do is that we get to be disidentified with those aspects of our happiness and suffering, while at the same time experiencing them even more clearly. So attention is not at all to be confused with pushing away feelings, not at all. It makes them more rich and vibrant, sometimes maybe even overwhelming. Sometimes there's too much TMI, too much information seems to be coming in. And we have this idea, some sort of self-image of being very simple and maybe just identified with one or two or three different kinds of stances in life. But with the cultivation of attention, we see that we are a vastly various array of colors, a truly vibrant palette that, frankly, what do we identify with? Somehow we are called to expand what we think that we are, what we feel that we are, through the cultivation of attention. And this is a very important aspect. Classic source for the practice of attention and mindfulness, and you have this quote in your handout, you don't have to read it now, Satipatthana Sutra says that mindfulness, or attention, is the sole way for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the destroying of pain. How does it destroy pain? Well, it destroys pain, or maybe we would say, also using Buddhist language and vernacular, we get freed up from that which we are no longer identified with. That is a hugely powerful, impactful effect of the cultivation of attention. So let's try to understand a little bit more then about what this would look like, how attention is cultivated. We've already said it's not just a mental skill. So when we go to cultivate attention, mindfulness, or gratitude, or any actually contemplative adventure, I would say, that we are opening ourselves up to, we really want to do it. We want to be there as completely as we can, because it's not just a mental skill. And we can see this right away. I love to quote, this is like one of the opening lines of the Satipatthana Sutra. Having gone to the forest, to the foot of a tree, or to an empty place, one sits down, cross-legged, keeps one's body erect and mindfulness alert. So this is quite important. Forest, of course, we can understand metaphorically. It can be your room. It can be your office with the door closed. It can be sitting up in bed before you actually lie down to sleep. But some space of peace and quiet in your life where you sit. And one sits at the foot of a tree, also in a metaphorical sense, I often like to say. Buddha is famous for having become enlightened at the foot of a tree, the Bodhi tree. You can still see its descendant in Bodh Gaya in India. And after many, many years of just sort of thinking this was, a nice part of the story, it's hot in India also, so it makes sense to sit under a tree. I began to realize that Buddha, and actually all of us who train in meditation traditions and who follow this instruction to keep the body erect, very interesting that that's in there. What's that going on there? Well, having the body erect means that all of the pathways through which the currents of our lives flow, including our breath, the most notable current of all, they can move more freely, more easily, more unobstructedly if the body is straight. The body actually wants to be straight. We cultivate a habit of slumping over, and we have a very odd custom of sitting in chairs that don't actually accommodate the needs of our bodies at all. So it's nice to be reminded that one is to keep the body erect for the opening of these energies. The kind of opening that is going to be conducive, as we've already seen, to cultivation of gratitude, of connection, of just awareness. Trees have roots, and energetically speaking, we also have roots. This is well known throughout the Asian traditions and all shamanic traditions. In fact, the modern Western type traditions following Descartes and others are quite alone, actually, in thinking that we just sort of march across the earth, the mere surface of the earth. So you consider for a moment that actually right now, you are seated directly above the center of the earth. And that there is actually support coming to you from there. So we like to say it's a deep seat. We don't usually take a deep seat. We're just perched on the edge of our chairs, ready to jump up at any moment, or even our meditation cushions. The phone rings. But this cultivation of a deep seat, being rooted like a tree, and at the same time, so you're seated here, you're rooted, perhaps now even having for a moment taken to mind this idea that you are connected and supported from the center of the earth. So what is it, how does a tree do? It's the more rooted it is, the more support there is for its leaves to turn to the sunlight, to sky, to space. And so there's something about sitting erectly, and the recommendation of the meditation posture, which is modeled by a tree, in my view, and implicitly in the Buddhist traditions, that is an invitation to sit strong and be wide open from the heart and crown up. So this whole open dimension, like the canopy of a tree. There's the body then, which is like this. So sap flows through a tree, and our minds ride steeds of wind. This is a given of really Oriental culture, not just Buddhist culture. The currents that move through our bodies, these winds, these energies, these flows, that's how consciousness, any consciousness, is always riding some type of energy. So when we calm down, what do we mean? We actually, if you consider what it means to calm down, it does mean to quiet a bit the flows in our body. And if you allow yourself to sit still, even for 15 minutes, maybe even for 5 minutes, my students sometimes find that transformative because it's so unaccustomed to our way of life, you will feel that your energy, your inner kind of fluctuations, it just feels settled down. We use the word, yeah, I've settled down now. And at the same time, your mind is settling, because the two are not actually different in principle. The Dalai Lama says, following this definition, these are standard definitions in the debate text that Tibetan Buddhists study. So matter is something that is atomically established. It's material. We agree with that, I think. Wind, or these currents that I'm talking about, is something that is light and moving. The wind, breeze. The motion, movement like this is also a movement. There are currents of flow involved in making this movement. It's not just the arm. Also, when I look out into the distance, something carries my consciousness to the object, and connection is made. Consciousness is clear and knowing. Now, Dalai Lama says in the universe in a single atom, he points out matter in its most subtle form is prana, or chi, a vital energy which is inseparable from consciousness. These are different aspects of a single reality. So in introducing the language of currents, of flows, of prana, and pointing out that our consciousness, that means our emotions, and if you think about it, we know this. When we're really angry, we say we're roiling with anger, right? There's something going on in the body, and a lot of studies and articulations about how emotions are really fundamentally experienced as sensations in the body. Certainly, very importantly, they're experienced in that way. In looking at this, we're talking about the lived body, not the material body simply. So the lived body has flow to it. It has movement. It has energy. It has currents. And these flows, these currents of our lives, are both what we attend to and that which attention itself rides, like a steed of wind. These currents move through various routes or channels in our body, and the body, the erectness of the body, modeled by the tree, lengthens and strengthens these pathways so that our currents of life move easily and smoothly. Flowing enhances knowing. You know, sometimes you're listening, you're talking to somebody, and you're totally gripped by what is being said. And there's a kind of flow, and we have a phrase popularized some years ago, we say we're in the flow. But in the West, we don't have yet, scientifically anyway, as far as I know, a really well-established category by which we can talk about what flow is. So in Asian materials, this is a rigorous category of analysis, actually, which is why I'm bringing into the conversation. We can even say that flowing is knowing, which is perhaps why in Indian literature, in Sanskrit, as Harvey Aronson, now my husband, who also taught Sanskrit, has often said, in Sanskrit, verbs of going are also verbs of knowing. Knowing, like going, takes you somewhere, which is why spiritual practice is considered a path. And like what is known energetically through attention is the core of our lived body. We are sensing into, as our awareness grows, our knowing knows more completely, and part of what we are present to is our own body. Sitting straight in this way, you experiment with it, it changes how we feel. It changes, if ever so slightly, your disposition, your presence in the world, gets us out of our heads. And of course, the body is absolutely central to human experience. Marcel Mauss famously observed that at the bottom of our mystical states, there are bodily techniques. His use of the term bottom is interesting, suggesting a sense of depth, the ocean of our being, below all the waves, shouting, to mix metaphors, below all of the waves that are roaring at the surface of our lives, at the bottom, deep in the ocean of our being, there's a sense of depth. Using this word bottom suggests a sense of depth and the power of the senses. Today's neuroscience refers to experience that comes mainly through the senses as bottom-up processing, distinguished for its rapidity and forcefulness from the filtering of assumptions, presumptions, ideas that are called top-down processing. And John illustrated earlier today beautifully the difference between being in your head, your mind, which of course can, at its choice, be in the past, present, or future, right? But the body and your breath are always in this moment. So if you are paying attention to your body, to your breath, to the flows as they are right now, currently, the currency of your currents, then you are in the present. You're in your life. And it's been suggested by a variety of research, some cited by Daniel Siegel, that the most effective way to achieve the clarity and nowness of bottom-up processing is to be with the body. So this is interesting as somebody who has studied this ancient tradition of observing the breath and the body, to find now this language in neuroscience is quite interesting. So when we talk about these the energies or currents, winds in the body, oral tradition, Tibetan tradition, they talk about three types of prana or energy, winds. One that is cultivated through rather advanced meditation practices known as the wind channel practices. These are, if you're familiar with the practices of becoming very hot, heat practices and so on. So that's one kind of, that's directed. Then there's undirected, the undirected winds. So particular winds can arise, channels open up in certain ways if one does those practices. In ordinary life, we have, by and large, undirected currents flowing through us. And then the enlightened state is beyond both. So when I'm talking today about the currents of our lives, I'm really talking about this second category, but I wanted you to see a little bit of that context. The body settling that occurs as we shift from ordinary thinking to attending to breath or body has to do, as I've already suggested, with the increasingly gentling of these flows. The depths reached in meditation are related with a profound stilling of our uniformly even flow of currents deep within the body. Stilling the body, in short, brings stillness to the mind. And stilling the mind, focusing deeply on something, anything, whether it's formal meditation, whether it's reading with something with great pleasure, listening to a great story, gardening, embroidering, knitting, these very simple tasks that we take such pleasure in, is because we are enjoying the settling and smoother flowing of our knowing in that process. We are more connected with what we are doing right at that time. There is no separation. So when we do this training, the classic focus, as you've already heard, is the breath. So what do? We're sitting like a tree, and then we have the intention to direct our attention to our breath. It's all a very intentional process. And we let our mind, our attention, rest on the breath. It's one way to do it. There are many methods. Then you become aware of your breathing. You can try it right now for a moment. You're aware of the in-breath, which is a great pleasure actually to take in nourishment when you need it, right? And then the pleasure of the relaxing with the out-breath, release. Very wonderful. Just mindful you breathe in and mindful you breathe out. Breathing in a long breath, you know I breathe in a long breath. Breathing in a short breath, you know I breathe in a short breath. You're just sitting down to be with your breath, letting everything else just slide away. That's your intention. What happens, of course, is that your mind skitters away to the past, to the future. Nonetheless, since body and breath, again, is in the present, if you train on a daily basis, even just a few minutes, 10, 15 minutes a day, but regularly, to be with your breath, you will see you have a greater capacity to settle down a little bit. We're just at the point in the semester where the students in my contemplative practicum at Rice are saying, oh, this is the first time. I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think, I'm so distracted. I'm always worried about my exams. And now I can see that after doing it for 5 or 6 weeks, just a little bit, there's some change. You will notice this because this is a natural capacity of the human organism. We have a capacity to settle. Waves have the capacity to settle into the ocean. Just how it is, and it's how we are. Nonetheless, now the traditional texts speak about distraction. Distraction is the enemy of attention. But with the kind of psychological language that we have in the West, we can understand that this distraction is a kind of cover term for a lot of very robust psychological resistance. As the Buddhist-oriented Berkeley writer Anne Lamott says, how alive do you want to be? We like to hide in the shadows. Hiding in the shadows is a comfort zone. We like our habit patterns. Even if we don't like them, we love them, right? We hang out with them. They're familiar because we've identified with them. And we need something we deeply feel to hang our identity on. So attention pursued to some amount, but and maybe joined with insight as well, it leaves us no place to hide. We're out of our comfort zone. We're just out there standing in the middle of space and wow, that's amazing, but hey, wait a second. I want to crawl under the covers and, just sleep. The sleep of ignorance, Buddhist calls it. So this is a real thing. And the kind of resistance that we will have to the true settling and opening of our capacity for attending will be linked with our stance in life. If we're very defended, as a stance in life, we will be defended against opening and the simple pleasure of attention. If we always like to be kind of confused and never too sure about what's going on because there's this kind of pleasurable haze over everything, we're not too directly confronting anything, then we will shy away from the cultivation of attention. So this is one place where there's a really important nexus between the spiritual and the psychological, and where these two things can really help each other. So we tell our Dawn Mountain students sometimes, you know, when we talk about what's going on with them, sometimes it's quite clear. You need not just to, you know, work toward attention, but there's some issues. You know, therapy could be helpful. And therapy also can be greatly enhanced if everybody is more aware and present in their body. Nelson Mandela famously in a 1994 inaugural speech quoted Marianne Williamson saying, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us." And in fact, in the Buddhist tradition, in Hindu traditions, in Christian traditions, in Sufi traditions, there is this offering to our awareness of the great ocean that we are, the great expansive sky that we are. And that can be disorienting to the extent that we are, again, identified with these things that attention is now going to bring to light, and is going to, we can't help but notice that if we cultivate attention, that what we are identified with, grief, sorrow, joy, being great, being inferior, is not as solid as it seems. And so that place we hang our hat is starting to look a little less robust. And that can be a challenge. We can feel that we begin to see that what our identity is, as we have ordinarily understood it, is perhaps not the be-all and end-all of what we are. Now, on the way to talking more about that, it would seem that in order to face this great vastness of light that we are, the Buddha nature or Christ nature or friend, the ocean that we are, that we would need some kind of really inner confidence and trust. This turns out to be a huge issue, actually, in spiritual practice. And I'm not talking about faith as such. I'm talking about confidence or trust in your own capacity to pray or meditate or connect or just be alive in the best way possible for you. And interestingly enough, cultivation, my friends for years have said, you know, since I started meditating, I just feel more confidence in life. I feel it starts to wake up parts of your body that you can start to rely on, that, you know, we might feel that we're just up here in our heads, but no, there's a big resource down here, you know, that really makes us feel more, just kind of more able in the world. So I thought maybe that's a bit of why it does seem to be confidence building to observe the breath. You might not expect that. Daniel Siegel, who's really intent on sharing mindfulness with the world, The Mindful Brain and other books, said something very interesting at a conference once. The regular exercise of mindful awareness seems to create the same kind of brain situation that those who are raised with, who gain healthy attachment have. It's really interesting. And I was in a small group conversation with him at one conference, and he said, well, it works like this. As a child, if you're hungry and mom or someone brings you food, the world starts to seem like a safe, trustable place, and you can let yourself connect to it. It's the beginning of healthy attachment. When you inhale, what do you expect to happen next? You expect to exhale, and you do. And this, he says, builds confidence, promotes secure attachment, like a parent who does what is expected. I think that is some of the healing property of cultivating attention. And we might expect that those who cultivation begin to have a different emotional stance than they had before, and that seems to be true. One more thing from Daniel Siegel as we move toward. So mindfulness, this is back to the bottom-up business. Although mindfulness is more than simply being aware of our senses, the direct root of sensation is an important component of direct experience. As we dissolve top-down influences, as we begin to see through our own ideas about the world and look, or a person, oh, I thought you were mean, but now I have actual experience of you. This is how racial prejudice dissolves also, right? That's been discovered for years. When you actually have real contact with a group of people or a person against you whom you were biased, you get direct experience that's very powerful and can begin to override. Living within the directness of our senses helps us to be grounded in the physical world, the mind, body, and relationships. Now, we've talked so far about cultivating awareness of one's breath, sometimes just a spot under the nose where you can feel the air move as you're breathing. That's a little harder to become aware of. But with a little ability there, we can do something else, which is identify a frame that will be the field of our awareness. And this is kind of incredibly profound as well as wonderfully simple. So, for example, once you've settled down a little bit, your body could become the field of your awareness, as we heard about this morning also. And you're aware of your whole body. And what you notice there is that the tendency is that when some itch comes up or some emotion comes up, there's a tendency, which now you can see very clearly, of your mind to collapse down onto that particular feeling or thought and to identify with it. And so the practice is to move back out, to occupy the whole field with your attention. You can do it with a tree. You can go outside on a beautiful day like today and, decide that the canopy of a tree will be your frame. And just try to be aware simultaneously of all the leaves, the different angles of sunlight on each one of them. And then a squirrel runs through, and you find that your attention is collapsing onto that squirrel, so then you expand your attention back out. Imagine if you were accomplished in considering your emotional life the field. So then your emotions arise, you're aware of them, but it's not all that you are. There's this larger field. Over time, emotions arise and cease. But what if it went even deeper, and it wasn't just time or the palette of your different emotions, but something like what Buddhists, particularly Longchenpa, a great figure, 14th century Tibet, there's a wonderful word, you can translate it as spacious matrix, or basic space. It also means something like the womb of space, this most subtle field in which actually everything is occurring. And science has its own analog to that, perhaps. This is talking about a state of consciousness which is both expanded and very precise. Now, we will find this to be a challenge when events arouse us in various ways. Maybe fear is up and the ground is breaking up under your feet and you're trying to hold on to your position, so the desire for stability becomes distorted as an expression of rigidity. In the Buddhist world, we talk about this as the earth element. The earth element properly is like just stability, holding your ground in a very equable kind of way, whereas rigidity is a distortion of that. And we find these earthquakes going on in ourselves, and we grab on even tighter to the identity that we are thinking we must, at all cost, and the cost can be quite considerable, at all costs we must hang on to. Now, of course, meditation addresses this, psychotherapy also addresses this. And we find through the practice of either that these patterns that we are stuck in, these superficial identities that are the wave, not the ocean, the cloud, not the sky, that we begin to become less affected to them and starts to feel good. And at some moment, what happens if the wave actually does dissolve back into the ocean, if the cloud actually does vanish into sky? What about that moment? What about the space that opens up at that very moment? H.J. Almas, a great figure from another contemplative tradition, the diamond approach, which also draws, particularly in this area, quite significantly in a certain way from Buddhism, points out the importance in therapy as well as in practice of being aware of this space. In other words, not just going from one pattern to maybe a more functional pattern, but actually noticing the space. So he says here, even when a self-image does dissolve without being immediately replaced, we're not just, because we have a habit of just jumping from one thing to the next. I had this great experience, fantastic. Now what, right? The practitioner is not likely to give the arising of spaciousness enough attention to recognize its actual significance in relation to the self-image, since if one's model of the possibilities of experience does not include the state of inner boundless space. Boundlessness is a common characteristic of really mystical, so-called mystical experiences across traditions. Boundless, oceanic, sky-like, space-like. So if we are to get a glimpse of this, which can occur also in therapy, why not be a clinician who points this out? Not to impose it on someone, but if somebody is feeling it, is recognizing it, not to pass over it, but to point it out, to acknowledge it in one's own or another's experience. It's a very significant moment, actually. It's a moment of expansion. And it comes due to a kind of release from not only these patterns as thought patterns, but also from the living currents that support them. It's a change not only in one's stance in the world, but in the streaming currents within the body, starting with the breath, which is palpably different when we're anxious and when we're not. It's not intellectual. It's not a narrative. It's a bottom-up sensed experience, as John also alluded to earlier. I think this is one of the most important things I want to share with you, actually, but I'm going to move on. To talk a little bit about other effects that come through the cultivation of attention, which leads into how we understand that attention is love. So there have been a number of studies. One just reported last November that they were actually studying two different types of meditation, calm and compassion. Well, you have to be calm. You have to have some base of attention in order to cultivate compassion. And they found differences in the response of the amygdala, part of the brain known for its importance for emotion. And the particular thing that they want to point to here is that they say that this is the first study to show that this is a difference that is measurable when the person is not meditating. In other words, it persists as change in the person after they meditate. So the conclusion, or the headline of this article was meditation produces enduring changes in emotional processing in the brain. And kind of the shamatha project, I don't know if one of the most kind of epic project on the study of mindfulness, Alan Wallace and Cliff Saron, who's UC Davis, has been going on for years and years. Very briefly, and you can read about it in this article, which you can just Google, they got together, I think it was 60 meditators for 3 months, so it's a big commitment. They meditated 7 hours a day in Feather Lake in Colorado. They installed the latest equipment on the premises, so they were measuring, taking all kinds of measurements of their brain. They were also having interviews. And the data is just so rich and deep, it's going to be years before we get a full understanding of what this data actually reveals. They just got a multi-million-dollar grant, yay, from the Templeton Foundation to continue their interpretation of this material. And just to summarize some of the important findings so far, they found that some differences in people who meditate, and these people were doing both focused attentional practices as well as what they call and what I described open awareness kind of practices when you're attending to an entire field or body of space. Purpose in life, interestingly enough, increases. And this was corresponded with a 30% increase in telomerase levels over the control group. So one's motivation, we could say one's zest for life, purpose and meaning are very important to us human beings, increases. Sense of well-being increases due to impulse control. We could also correlate that with what we could call ethical or wholesome behavior. Flexibility, very interesting. To the extent that you develop the capacity to withhold habitual response, because remember, one is no longer identifying with those responses as much. We are able to catch them as they're arising. So we're not as stuck in them, and this lays the groundwork for improved adaptive psychological function. Another way in which the spiritual and the psychological can really marry to support human growth. Compassionate connection. Very interesting. I've heard this finding repeated in some other studies that I've heard about. So people who cultivate this, attention makes you more sensitive. Bless you. And what happens is that by various measures, they understand, practitioners after this retreat, they are both more sensitive to filmed events of great pain and suffering, but they don't recoil from them. Very interesting. So that's a basis for compassionate interaction. If you're so horrified by someone's suffering that you cannot bear to be present at it, then the compassionate interaction, it may or may not become pity, but you have no way to really be present and grounded and interactive. And finally, I want to say, sorry, I'm not good at this. Maybe that'll work. I want to say something about attention and connection, attention and love. We all know what it feels like when we receive wanted attention. Someone listens. We feel like they love us. Being a good listener is an extremely positive trait. Attention brings us closer to our own oceanic depths and to others. When we see, we touch, energetically speaking. So in classic Indian and later Tibetan theories of perception, eye consciousness, like all consciousness, there is a steed of wind which connects the eye consciousness to the object. So when we look someone else in the eyes, we talk about eye contact and how impactful that is. And people now who talk about limbic response say that the eye contact, it really is contact. That two people's nervous systems are actually affecting each other. This is in the scientific literature these days. There's still no mechanism, as far as I know, by which to actually talk about what is making contact, right? But again, if we have the vocabulary of currents of life, energy, the steed of wind, that's what's carrying your eye consciousness to the other person's eye. There's an impact there. And similarly, when we speak, we are affecting people, right? Sometimes people say, somebody, oh, your voice is so soothing. The guys who talk about insurance on the TV ads, are you in good hands? I always feel, oh, I want him to talk to me, right? Why? There's some energy. There's some energy that's coming your way. Jigme Nyingma says the essence of speech, that's what speech is energy. It's wind. Words also ride a steed of wind. And wind, energy, currents, these are impactful. When we step into a river, we feel the current. That's how we know what's going on in the river. When we connect with each other, mention the word vibes. So now we have a traditional technical term. We don't have to say vibes anymore and be hippies like we were. In the old days, we can talk about the currents. I just thought this was so amazing. You may be familiar with this. This is an old study. In terms of impact, even a 2 to 3 week old infant will mimic the face. Somebody makes a face in front of them. We're hardwired for this kind of connection. And incredibly, infants as young as 42 minutes will imitate the facial expression of an adult. And facial expressions, as Paul Ekman has shown, are associated with a particular pattern of psychological, physiological arousal. So the face that you make is, it tells something very profound about what is going on with you. We sense others' feelings. Our feelings shift in response. We respond to what the senses bring home. We feel other people. And it's time, I think, to honor that, not as a kind of woo-woo science or new age even, but actually a palpable part of life that attention makes even more vivid. Are you smiling? See? We don't lose that. We're always impacting each other. I love this verse from Rumi, talking about, one person is talking about how he knows another human being. Not like other people do by making effort of asking questions or noticing his face or anything like that. No, he says, when I start speaking, a powerful right arm of words sweeping down, I know him from what I say. And how I say it, because there's a window open between us, mixing the night air of our souls. That spacious matrix, we're all in it. We are all waves in that, actually. Of course we communicate with each other. And so, attention matters. As we go along the path of life, may it be as colorful as this. Inside matters, outside matters. These can't actually be separated. A capacity for mindful attention means a capacity to hold everything life offers us, pain and happiness both, and access to a deeper sense of being that is not entirely governed by either of these, by any particular moment, by any particular wave, by any particular cloud formation. They pass through us. This may not take us through the pearly gates, may not be the supreme transcendence of nirvana, but without question, it is a release and a relief from life as we otherwise might know it. All praise and gratitude for the cultivation of attention. Okay. I'll stop here and hope that we can have a few questions.
Thanks, Ann. That was it's wonderful. I've had the great privilege of being in a study group with Ann and Harvey for a while, and I always learned a lot, just like I did today.
We did too.
One of the things that occurred to me when in my practice with one of my patients is about to start a meditation or to go to Dawn Mountain and various stuff, I'm always pleased with that because as you said, it reinforces the sort of things for the work I do, the expressive psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. But I wonder if there are disorders or conditions in which that sort of cultivation of attention with the, and I think you put it nicely, makes us more vulnerable and open, is a relative contraindication for those same practices.
Yeah, it's an excellent, excellent question. And you all who are practicing psychotherapists, I'm sure know more about this than I do, but surely somebody who is still roiling from a traumatic experience, for example, somebody who is very fragile, somebody who really doesn't know who they are in any kind of conventional sense, they probably need a lot of support before they can benefit from extensive cultivation of attention. So it would be very important either for a meditation teacher or for the psychotherapist who's ever working with a person to kind of calibrate things, as you always do. Right?
Specifically about substance use disorders, how do you think about that?
Wow, I wish I knew more of the research on that, but I don't. I think I've heard that people who are working with attention make a lot of claims for it. I don't know specifically about substance abuse. I'd like to, though. I'll try to find out.
My residents are in the audience because
Yeah.
two of the questions are the same.
Yeah, very important. Are you aware, has research been done on working with substance abusers and meditation? My guess is it could be very significant but they would need a lot of support because they would come in contact with the pain of where they've been as they start to see where they could be. And this is also true on the spiritual path. As you start to realize you're an ocean, there can be a lot of grief for all of the time you have spent just being a little wave. And I think the same thing must be true there.
A question is, some of my meditation students insist on laying down during meditation. I want them to be comfortable. I let them lie down. Is this right or wrong?
I know. People everywhere like to lie down. Well, again, I think it depends. And it's not the tradition, at least in the Buddhist tradition, because you're cultivating clarity. And the tendency in lying down is that clarity goes away. However, if, again, always these things need to be very finely calibrated to the individual, using everything that you know about practice and psychology and the person. I mean, I would say if somebody is so agitated, and some people are, that they really can't sit still or experience any kind of stillness in that way, yes, let them lie down for a while, They want to listen to music, too, the right students. And if that's what they need as a bridge, then maybe that's important.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.